where you see the passing of time,
The crowds in St. Peter's Square are praying like mad for the Pope's light.
where moments refuse to die,
This is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe.
and where victory lives on.
Plenty of girls are being kissed by plenty of boys they don't know, and they do not care.
You can love it, hate it, embrace it, or turn away.
Lennon was shot to death late last night outside his apartment building.
But it is a past we all share.
Come on out here and give me a salute. Big Navy salute.
This is where yesterday has a home, where we wonder what it was like back then
Go forward, knights, in safety.
and not too long ago.
His spirit must live on.
It's where history has its place and where the past comes alive. The History Channel.
If you lived during the Great Depression, you'll remember FDR's fireside chats, Fibber McGee and Molly, and the glass dishes they gave away at movie houses. I certainly do. My family ate on dishes that we brought home from our favorite theaters in Queens, the Plaza, the Jamaica, or the Los Valencia. Before the Depression, only rich people had glass tableware, which was always handmade. When machine-made glass came along, it was so cheap that the theaters could afford to give it away. Along with the movie business, glass making was one of the few industries that actually grew during the Depression. Those free dishes are now highly sought collector's items. They call them Depression glass, and in some cases they're worth hundreds of dollars. You'd better check your attic. But first, come with me to a time when for a few cents you got a double feature, a free plate, and a gilded, air-conditioned hideaway from the Great Depression. There may have been a depression on, but you wouldn't have known it at the local movie house.
If you had 15 cents during the Depression, you went to the movies. It was an escape hatch.
Nobody talked about the media then, but in the America of the 1930s, they were a powerful force. They could let you escape.
The last thing they would give up was a radio because it was a connection with humanity.
They could also confront you with stark reality. Photographers like Dorothea Lange made you look hard times right in the eye.
It wasn't the Depression that she photographed. She photographed the walking wounded.
Sometimes the line between fantasy and reality was blurred.
Landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars.
At their best, though, the mass media of the 1930s brought you hope.
Let us unite in banishing fear. Together, we cannot fail.
The light of a movie projector could become the light at the end of the tunnel and maybe give you a glimpse of a better life to come. You paid as little as 15 cents. And the minute you walked in the door, you entered another world. A Spanish castle or Gothic fantasy. And probably the only air-conditioned place in town. A white-gloved usher with a chromium-plated flashlight led you down a darkened aisle. As you took your seat, the show was already in progress. Because in the 1930s, the movies ran continuously. You walked in whenever you got there, and 3 or 4 hours later you'd say, well, this is where I came in. Or you might just stick around and watch the show again.
It was get away from it. An hour or two of make-believe. Beautiful people, lovely scenery, adventure, excitement, success.
Theaters gave you more than just movies. They gave you newsreels, short subjects, even prizes and giveaways. In 1932, 60 million Americans went to the movies every week, leaving the Depression behind, if only for a few hours, and maybe dreaming of Hollywood. Even in the 30s, Hollywood was still a place where it seemed like the American dream could come true.
Ah, Hollywood. You'd better be getting yourself a good husband and stop mooning about Hollywood. You know what she wants to do? She wants to go to Hollywood. I've known it all along. I've seen her making faces in the mirror and talking to herself. That's what comes of your movies.
Why, what would you do if you did go to Hollywood?
I'd be an actress. I would, I tell you. I've always known I could.
America's need for escape kept the studios humming through the early Depression years. Hollywood was always on the lookout for fresh, young talent.
In those days, they were scooping up any kind of a young person who didn't have two heads and could sing to go to Hollywood to do all those musicals. So everybody got tapped. It wasn't just me, but I was thrilled.
Here we are, the Wampus Baby Stars of 1932. The 11th group selected by these Hollywood publicity men who predict, with your encouragement, we will be the screen stars of tomorrow.
Miss Ginger Rogers.
How do you do?
Not every young hopeful ended up with a studio contract. Even those who did weren't exactly living it up. Starting salary for movie actors was around $150 a week. Good money when the average working stiff was taking home $35 if he had a job at all. But actors earned every dollar that they made.
Hollywood was turning out 500 films a year, but nevertheless, each one is handmade. It's not really an assembly line. Even bad movies are handmade.
I started in I think February of 1932. I made 9 pictures that year. That meant that I was making 2 pictures at a time. I had to be in makeup at 6 o'clock in the morning to be on the set at 9 o'clock. And we would work till 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock the next morning. The hours were murderous.
More and more, so were the films themselves. Tough guys like Edward G. Robinson weren't going to let hard times stand in their way. Soon, movie screens were filled with fast-talking, big-city slickers of every description.
Listen, dear, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened. Wait till I tell you. I just captured Earl Williams, the murderer. Yeah, right. Wait a minute. Please don't tell anybody, honey. I know. But listen, something terrific has happened. It's the greatest thing of my life, honey. Wait. Hold on. Never more.
The women got tougher, too. They called them gold diggers. But audiences knew what that really meant.
It's not bad, this, huh? I'll tell you more about it in the morning. What do you mean? You can tell an awful lot about the liquor you drink the night before by where you find your hat the next morning.
These new kinds of movies called for new kinds of movie stars. Back in the 20s, the stars had been exotic, faraway creatures like Rudolph Valentino. 30s stars had names like Ruby, Jimmy, Joan, Glenda. Glamorous sometimes, but more important, smart, tough, American. Cagney, Harlow, Crawford, Gable, Davis, Bogart. Even new stars and 500 new movies a year couldn't keep the Depression from hitting the movie industry. In 1931, box office receipts started a nosedive that would last for the next 2 years. People were having trouble scraping together even the few cents they needed for a ticket. Movie moguls like Sam Goldwyn looked at their sprawling studios and the huge debts they'd racked up when they converted to sound, and they panicked. Some tried to boost ticket sales with the oldest trick in the book: more sex. In picture after picture, producers got away with as much as they could. In late 1932, an overweight 40-year-old Broadway veteran wiggled her way onto the screen.
Hello, folks. I wish you were up here at Mr. Gorman's beautiful theater to see the grand opening of premiere of my new picture, I'm No Angel. Of course, I didn't call it I'm No Angel for nothing. Don't forget, come up and see me sometime.
Mae West, the Great Depression's leading sex symbol. West's characters had healthy sex lives and never suffered for it in the last reel. For the Blue Noses, West was the final straw.
And surely, in this day, we need the motion pictures. But we are all interested in clean, high moral motion pictures. And we hope that it will not be necessary for the many houses to close.
Mae West had Hollywood on her side, but that was nothing compared to the Legion of Decency, a censorship group formed by Roman Catholic bishops in 1934. The Legion threatened a boycott of all Hollywood movies by all American Catholics unless something was done. Studio heads dusted off their old, unenforced production code and set up a censorship office headed by Mr. Joseph Breen.
Our American people are a pretty homely and wholesome crowd. Cockeyed philosophies of life, ugly sex situations, cheap jokes, and dirty dialogue are not wanted. Decent people don't like this sort of stuff, and it is our job to see to it that they get none of it.
By late 1934, censorship was an integral part of the movie business. All movies, trailers, posters, even stills had to be approved by the Production Code Office, or they would not be seen. The code covered every sin in the book: murder, drug use, skimpy costumes, and even the slightest hint of sex.
Ludicrous is the right word. If even married people can't be shown in bed, and if there always has to be at least one foot on the floor, and if evil is always punished, and you're dealing with unreality by definition.
The concept of self-regulation set up in 1934 survives to this day in the form of the ratings given to movies and television programs. The year the censors clamped down was also the first year Shirley Temple made an appearance in the box office top 10. When the Production Code seal of approval appeared at the beginning of movies, audiences booed. But they kept buying tickets as often as they could. Sanitized or not, movies were still the great escape. And there was another way to escape your troubles during the Great Depression. A brand new medium that could bring the outside world into your own home. You might have been a farm kid in a wind-blown Kansas shack, or a weary housewife in a Brooklyn cold water flat. But with a tabletop radio from the Five and Dime, you had a link to the outside world.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From the Meridian Room in the Park Plaza Hotel in New York City, we bring you the music of Raymond Raquello and the Monkees.
Special bulletin from the Press Radio News. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was electrocuted at 8:47 tonight for the murder of the Lindbergh baby.
DeSoto and Chrysler present to you Major Edward Bowes and his original Amateur Hour.
It was a godsend to them, especially when it came to the Depression years. It was something that you could enjoy on the level of a crystal set. People built their own sets.
People who were losing everything, who had to give up a home and so on, the last thing they would give up was a radio because it was a feeling of connection with humanity.
Radio and radio networks were still new when the crash hit. It took another couple of years to figure out just what people wanted to hear.
Zephyrs through the Everglades, wafting reverie's dream to me.
The first impulse was to be very pompous. Weirdly enough, announcers wore tuxedos to do their announcing. They had a feeling that this was something cultural.
Comedians were among the first to really make radio work for them by adapting to a new medium.
There is no equivalent for Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin in radio. The slapstick of visual comedy has to be translated into speech and into sound effects.
Tell me, Mr. Moody, what are your feelings about the radio?
I don't hold with furniture that talks.
Yeah.
Most radio comics had grown up in vaudeville. Radio was dramatically different. A good vaudeville act could last a year or more, while the performers barnstormed the country one town at a time. On the radio, the whole country heard the act in one night. Making their material fresh week after week became a challenge for comedians like Fred Allen.
In these hectic days of radio, I figure that the average comedian tells more jokes in 6 months than a great stage comedian like Raymond Hitchcock probably told in an entire lifetime.
Radio comics figured out that they could take their regular shtick and play variations on the same themes, keeping their material familiar but always changing. It was the birth of situation comedy.
Enclose a sample of my handwriting.
Come in.
Fibber McGee?
You betcha, Bud.
Do you need a gag writer?
No, we don't.
Oh, no?
Too many comedians on this show.
Radio gave comics a chance to make people laugh using nothing but sound.
The comedians and the directors and the writers would say, if you're going to do a crash, it has to be bigger and better than anything we've ever done. We want it to sound funny.
Look for it, dearie.
Oh, I know where it is. It's right here in the hall clock.
Oh, no, no.
I gotta straighten out that closet one of these days.
Smart radio comedians knew enough to hire good writers. With a show a week, comedy became serious business. Writers kept massive joke files with categories ranging from politics to mothers-in-law.
Man on vacation sends postcard. Dear mother-in-law, this is a picture of Grant's tomb. Wish you were here.
Sometimes it was the sponsors whose needs changed the programs.
How many of you housewives are kitchen slaves? How many of you are still cooking in the horse and buggy era?
Soap companies were looking for a way to reach their biggest customers, housewives. In the 30s, most women were stuck at home all day. Radio was a natural way for advertisers to reach them. Some clever writers created a new kind of serial drama designed just for women, the soap opera.
Just think, John, Jerry and Sue and the baby, they're safe from want.
Yes. And you and I, we're free. Free to marry, to live side by side and be happy. Forever and ever.
Darling.
For some listeners, the fantasy of soap operas became reality.
We wanted people to have air credit writers. And they took the view, well, that's not possible for daytime serials because people believe those are real. And that would spoil the whole thing.
By the mid-1930s, radio was as much a part of American life as the 4th of July. More people had radios than telephones. It wasn't uncommon for half the sets in the country to be tuned into the same popular show. The panorama of radio programming filled the evening air.
In the summertime, you could live in a big flat building, and God help you if you didn't shut your window because the other windows were open, and you were hearing 8 or 9 different types of programs.
I did not. There was a fly on my nose.
Why didn't you brush him off?
Say, every listener counts.
Please talker, but that's not enough. Somebody should tip him off that no one can get by with B.O.
Can be consolidated. Treat your stomach right.
Of all the peoples of the world, the Americans stand most in fear of a moment's silence. For 82 out of every 100 U.S. citizens, radio provides each day in the year a sure and ever-present escape from their own lives into an ether universe of crackling news, music, costly entertainment, and romantic adventure.
Of all the programs that radio brought into American homes during the Great Depression, none were more reassuring than Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Fireside Chats.
Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. Together, we cannot fail.
Like the comedians who came to radio from vaudeville, FDR knew that he had to use radio carefully and not use up his best material.
He only commented on this or that when he thought it was absolutely essential regarding a major issue. In a way, I think he saved his ammunition so that when he did speak, people really were glued to the radio.
A few timid people who fear progress will try to give you new and strange names for what we are doing. Sometimes they will call it fascism, and sometimes communism. But in so doing, they are trying to make very complex and theoretical something that is really very simple and very practical.
People dropped what they were doing, delayed dinner, or finished their dinner first in a hurry, and they wanted to hear what the president had to say. It was important for them.
And radio itself was important to Depression America. It gave people a chance to hear from their president, to keep in touch with the outside world, to laugh for a few minutes in the face of hard times. While radio artists were coming up with new forms of entertainment, photographers were looking hard times right in the eye and creating the most harrowing images of the Great Depression. Certain images immediately conjure up the Great Depression. None evoked the era more powerfully than these photos taken by government photographers to document the poverty of rural America. Among them, the most famous single image of the Depression. This is the story of how that photo was created, the photographer who created it, and how it almost didn't happen. The land had dried up, and the farms were dying. Midwestern families sometimes had no choice but to pick up and leave. Many journeyed west to California, not knowing just what they'd find. California was supposed to be paradise, perfect weather, and plenty of work. Migrants soon found out that things could be as tough in California as they'd been back in Oklahoma. In the early days of the Roosevelt administration, government agencies battled for their piece of the New Deal pie. The California State Relief Agency had been using photographs to draw attention to the plight of migrant farmers. One good photo said more than hundreds of pages in a government report. The photos that spoke the most powerfully were taken by Dorothea Lange. When new dealers in Washington figured out that what worked in California could work for them, Lange was put on the federal payroll. Lange had not begun her career taking pictures of the down and out. She was a studio photographer with a reputation for very simple portraits that captured the essence of her subjects.
Dorothea photographed the elite merchant class of San Francisco. She was a beautiful portrait photographer, just beautiful. And she immediately got what she called the cream of the trade.
The Depression's victims were right outside the window of Lange's studio.
And she looked out and she saw people with double-breasted suits, which working people didn't wear, Homburgs working people didn't have. And they were down and out and taking daily 50 cents a day laboring jobs from the city, things like that.
And the incongruity for her of the work that she was doing and the real life that was pulsating on the street below her was too much for her. And one day she said to herself, I'm going to go out and photograph this.
Lange's first attempt at photographing the Depression produced a classic image titled White Angel Breadline.
Her rich clients would look at this photograph and say, what are you going to do with that? And she didn't know. She only knew that she'd been compelled to go out and take the photograph.
The skills she developed while photographing San Francisco's wealthiest families were now put to work documenting the people the Depression had hit the hardest. To Lange, a successful photo depended on the subject's trust. That she was a woman and that she walked with a limp from childhood polio made her less intimidating to a farm family who might never have had its picture taken before.
She approached people slowly, casually, and said, I'm from the government. We are interested in where you came from and where you're going. Well, now we came from Oklahoma and we're heading for Bakersfield. That's interesting. Have you got enough gas to get? No, we don't have enough gas. We have to get to work here and work there. And then she'd start photographing. By then, the photography was part of the conversation.
Lange's photos made their way into reports, magazines, and newspapers and put a human face on grim statistics.
I don't believe that anybody ever photographed the human face with greater eloquence or understanding than my mother did. And she called the human face the universal language. Without speaking, people could tell you what was in their hearts or in their minds, just in the way that they looked at the camera.
It wasn't the Depression that she photographed. She photographed the walking wounded.
Though she took nearly 4,000 photographs for the government, Lange's most famous photo almost wasn't taken. In March 1936, she had been traveling around California for a month following the migrants. She was heading home to San Francisco, feeling that she hadn't produced anything of value on her trip. It was cold and looked like rain as she passed the small town of Nipomo, about 4 hours south of San Francisco. She saw a small sign on the side of the road that read Pea Pickers Camp. She didn't stop, but gradually developed a hunch that she might be missing something important.
Never a fast driver, driving along maybe at 45, maybe 50 miles an hour. Got 20 miles up the road, and she found herself against her will, pulling off the side of the road, turning around, and going back.
When she arrived at the camp, Lange found a woman and 7 children huddled in a makeshift shack. The woman was a widow who had come from Oklahoma with the children, looking to work in the pea fields. A sudden storm had ruined the crop and left the family stranded. They were living on half-frozen peas from the fields and birds that the children managed to kill. That morning, the mother had sold the tires from her car to buy food for her children. Lang set down her tripod and began taking photographs.
Then finally the kids got tired and they jumped in behind their mother and click, click, she got it.
Lang stopped for only a few minutes. She took 6 photographs. She didn't get the woman's name, but she headed back to San Francisco feeling that she'd finally gotten some shots that made her trip worth it.
And so Dorothea, even though she hadn't seen her family for a month, she got up first thing in the morning, went down in the darkroom, proofed those photographs, made some prints, and rushed them over to the San Francisco News.
The News published the photos on March 10th. Within days, 20,000 pounds of food arrived to feed the starving farmers. Lang's photo became known simply as Migrant Mother. Its subject was eventually identified as Florence Thompson. She and her family soon found shelter in a government-run camp. Thompson remained a migrant worker for several years and lived in California for the rest of her life. She died in 1983 at the age of 80. The negative of Migrant Mother is held at the Library of Congress. Decades later, it is the single most requested photograph in the library's collection.
Dorothea had a wonderful sense of Migrant Mother. You know, she said, I see Migrant Mother reproduced in magazines all over the world or on billboards. That photograph no longer belongs to me. It now belongs out in the world.
Columbia now presents a special
Photography wasn't the only medium that faced up to harsh realities. By the end of the decade, radio would become a trusted news medium and face the rage of listeners when that trust was violated. In the early Depression years, radio was great at entertaining you, taking your mind off your troubles.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen?
By decade's end, things were getting better in America, just as the rest of the world seemed to be heading into a tailspin. Radio would bring these terrifying events right into your living room. Radio journalism got off to a rocky start.
Believe it or not, radio networks had no news departments at all until the coming of the war.
And I know it.
Special events departments covered things like political conventions, but they weren't equipped to handle breaking news. Part of the trouble came from newspapers, which fought radio news at first. Newspaper editors saw radio as a threat, stealing advertisers and turning readers into listeners. Even worse, sometimes radio newsmen stole the news itself.
In the early radio, a lot of them read from the newspaper. They just used the material in the news, assuming that was all everybody's property because it was out.
In retaliation, some papers stopped carrying radio listings altogether. Newspapers eventually came around, especially after they figured out that people actually bought the paper to get a look at the radio listings. Real radio journalism came gradually, sometimes by accident. In 1937, radio captured the biggest news story of the year in a way no other medium could have.
It's practically standing still now. They've got rope out of the nose of the ship. The van had cracked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It burst into flames. Get it started, get it started. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between us. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.
Radio made the Hindenburg tragedy horribly real for millions of listeners, but the broadcast had happened almost totally by chance. A true test of radio's ability to bring history-making events into America's living rooms came on March 13th, 1938. Hitler's troops stormed into Austria.
Right at this moment, Austria is no longer a nation, but is now officially a part of the German Empire. Austria and Germany are being welded together under one command, one army, one policy, one economic compact.
CBS Radio was best equipped to cover the crisis. The network had placed correspondents in all the major European capitals, knowing that war was on the way. New technology allowed the network to bring live reports from Europe on very short notice. When Austria fell, the network saw an opportunity to do something unprecedented.
Paul White, who was the director of special events at CBS, he got the idea of taking a half hour and putting a lot of them together for one program.
This is Bob Trout. Columbia now presents a special broadcast, which will include pickups direct from London, from Paris, and such other European capitals as at this late hour abroad have communication channels available.
No one had ever brought together late-breaking reports from thousands of miles away directly into American homes as they were happening.
It is a little hard, perhaps, for the present-day listener to understand the extent of that involvement and excitement and how magical and rewarding it was to listen to voices coming from these areas.
This is Edward Murrow speaking from Vienna. It's now nearly 2:30 in the morning, and Herr Hitler has not yet arrived. No one seems to know just when he will get here, but most people expect him sometime after 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The crowds are courteous, as they've always been. But many people are in holiday mood. They lift the right arm a little higher here than in Berlin.
Over the next few months, the European situation worsened. Through the Munich crisis in September and the succeeding political chaos, listeners got used to late-breaking reports interrupting their favorite shows. There was a monster on the rampage in Europe, and radio was bringing the almost unbelievable news of his conquests into American homes. On October 30th, 1938, people listening to CBS heard a bulletin that announced the arrival of a monster on American soil.
Now, nearer home, comes a special bulletin from Trenton, New Jersey. It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton. The flash in the sky was visible within a radius of several hundred miles, and the noise of the impact was heard as far north as Elizabeth. We have dispatched a special mobile unit to the scene.
Smart listeners should have known that this wasn't just another bulletin. Sprinkled throughout were references to fictional places, people, and events. But people weren't listening for details.
Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from that mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. The whole field's caught up by the woods.
Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange beings who landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars.
The widespread panic that followed that broadcast, the Mercury Theater's production of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, has passed into legend.
It came right after the Munich crisis, about that time, when we sat at a radio for days wondering what was going to happen. It was a period of great tension, and I think it had a lot to do with it.
It's quiet.
The show's creator, Orson Welles, faced a horde of angry reporters the following afternoon.
Of course, you're deeply shocked and deeply regretful about the results of last night's broadcast. And it came rather as a great surprise to us that a story, the fine H.G. Wells classic fantasy, the original for so many succeeding comic strips and adventure stories and novels about a mythical invasion by monsters from the planet Mars, should have had so profound an effect upon radio listeners.
but never thought it was anything but funny. There are pictures of me made about 3 hours afterwards, looking as much as I could like an early Christian saint. I didn't know what I was doing, but I'm afraid that I'm not as hypocritical as anybody could possibly get.
One doesn't believe in the radio audience much. You don't know that whether they're listening or not. You have no idea how many people are listening or what they're thinking. I had every hope that...
I had friends who, ran out. One of my favorites was Jack Barrymore, who had a kennel of Great Dane dogs. And when he heard it, he went out and undid all the kennels and said, "Fend for yourselves."
The irony of the press outcry against the show was not lost on its creator.
The hue and cry was from the newspapers who'd been losing all their advertising to radio, of course.
It was more than just the outrage of newspapers, though. People had come to place faith in this new kind of journalism. When Orson Welles took advantage of that faith, listeners took it very personally.
Radio is new, and we are learning about the effect it has on people. We learned a terrible lesson.
Just as radio's power was reaching its height, a small band of technicians was getting started on a new medium that would pull together a little Hollywood, a little radio, and a little vaudeville. Within a year of the War of the Worlds broadcast, it would make its debut, and eventually change American life in ways that no one could have imagined. If you went to the 1939 New York World's Fair, you took in the Futurama, the Helicline, the Aquacade, and the electrified farm of tomorrow. And at the RCA Pavilion, you got a look at something that resembled a radio, but with a small, flickering black and white screen. People had been talking about television for years. At the tail end of the 1930s, it looked like they just might get it to work.
You'd better take another look. He never had a camera like that one. That's a television camera.
Holy smokes, does it work?
Of course. You go down there, Mr. Middleton. You can see and hear Bud on a whole row of television receivers.
Radio was still king. Movies were thriving. But inventors and entrepreneurs were making slow, steady progress. People who saw early demonstrations usually asked technicians one question.
What are you going to do with it? So he said, well, we figure that sometime in the future, a man will come into a Detroit bank and want to cash a check, and they won't know him there because he's from New York, and they'll ask him to step into a little booth like this, and they'll put him on the screen, and the people in New York will look at him and say, yes, that's him.
The radio networks got involved in the mid-30s with an eye not on two-way communication, but entertainment.
Sight teamed up with sound to bring the world to your easy chair.
Even with network money pouring in, the first TV studios still had an improvised air about them. Programming was often whatever the director could come up with that was cheap and available. Actors suffered under massive batteries of lights. The temperature in the studios often approached 120 degrees. It was so hot in front of the cameras that cooking shows were confined to making salads. And the audiences were tiny. Most network programs only reached New York City and an audience of about 500 people. To some, TV seemed like more of an aberration than a medium.
It didn't sound like an attractive thing at all, and for actors it was absolutely miserable. I found myself very little interested in the whole thing.
But if you were one of the lucky New Yorkers with a set in 1939, you saw something amazing. The President of the United States opening the World's Fair on a screen in your own home. Television was on its feet. Despite the primitive technology and slapdash programming, some could see potential there.
I remember passing a television monitor at CBS in the newsroom, and there was a daytime ball game on being telecast from Yankee Stadium. and I saw the beautiful vista of that ball field, Yankee Stadium. There were a couple of men on bases. The pitcher throws a ball, and the batter knocks it out of the park. And at that moment, with the cheering crowd and the excitement on the tube, I thought, there is the future. That radio is doomed.
Now pan across the orchestra from the brass to the strings. Now back to your original position and pan over to include the conductor.
Radio wasn't doomed just yet. World War II would hold TV back for a few years. Despite the big splash at the fair, television was still just barely peeking over the horizon. For Americans living through the Great Depression, the mass media offered a chance to escape their troubles and the ability to keep in touch with the world around them. New forms of entertainment and new ways of conveying information were created and perfected and remain with us today. During the 30s, the media assumed a role that they had never played before, one that has continued ever since. They became an integral part of every American's daily life, an important legacy of the Great Depression. How times have changed. I'm told that one of those golden movie palaces of my youth is now a church. The others are simply gone, victims of television. When TV hit its stride in the 1950s, there was a slump at the box office, followed by a wave of theater closings. Newsreels, short subjects, double features, they're mostly gone too. All that remain are a few collectible pieces of Depression glass.